Today we're going to make a wooden sword. Let's build that. I started out by cutting a 2-foot section of oak. This happens to be 1 3/4 inches. I then ripped this down to 1/2 inch thick since it was originally 3/4 style. I then set my miter saw to 45 degrees and cut a point to the tip of one side of the blade. I set my table saw to 15 degrees so I could shave the sides of the blade to make the edge taper. I set my table saw to 3/8 of an inch, that way they didn't quite touch and it would give it a more round over toy-like feel versus a sharp point. So as you can see, it has the basic shape, but it's not aggressive. I then measured my handle at about 4 inches and I added an extra 1/2 inch for the hilt, so I made a mark on both sides at 4.5 inches. I then set this tape down on my table saw to see exactly where my blade came out. I set the fence so I could cut a 1/2 inch tang in the center of the blade, but I used that tape and the line to make sure that it don't go too far. As you can see, the bottom of the blade will cut deeper than the top since it's rounded. So then I set my crosscut sled to the right depth and I did a test cut. Once I got my height right, I followed my 4.5 inch mark and cut each side of my tang. As you can see, this is still holding on by just little scraps of wood, so I used my scroll saw to clean up these cuts. I then clamped the blade to the table and used a file to clean up all these cuts. Now it's time to make the hilt. I used some black walnut. I cut a 4.5 inch by 1/2 inch block. I then also ripped this down to 1/2 inch thick to match the blade. I marked out the center of this block and I drilled a hole smaller than my 1/2 inch tang. I then could mark out my 1/2 inch tang square using the hole and the guidelines I made before to get the tang hole directly in the center. I then used my scroll saw to cut out this 1/2 inch square. Once it was cut out, I could clamp it to the bench and use a file to bring in the final fitment. I slowly just took off some material till the blade would fit all the way down into the hilt. I then cut the corners of my hilt to a 45 just to give it a more decorative edge. Then sanded my blade and my hilt with some 220 to take off the burn marks and kind of round over all the rough edges. I didn't sand the tang while I was doing this, as I'm going to be adding some more material. I didn't want those to get rounded over too much. I then took my cutoff from the blade and cut a 1/2 inch strip as well as a 3/4 inch strip. I then cut 2 pieces from each of these strips at 4 inches. I then glued on the hilt and clamped the 1/2 inch strips behind it onto one side of the tang. I could use a chisel to clean up all the squeeze out and make sure that all the edges of the 2 scab pieces I glued on were flush. I then could apply the 3/4 inch pieces to the opposite sides. This will make the full tang a full 3/4 by 3/4 inch. I clamped those, and while those were drying I worked on my pommel. I shaved down the tip of a 1 inch dowel with my table saw to make a cone taper. The cone was a little long, so I chopped it shorter with the chop saw. I then chopped the pommel off and just gave it a sanding with some hand sand to take off the round edges. Then you can drill a hole down the center of your pommel. This is where you will mount it to the bottom of the tang. I also used a countersink to make sure the screw didn't stick out. I then drilled the same hole in the bottom side of the tang in the center. Once the sides gapped, I could take off the clamps. Now it's time to wrap the handle. I drilled a hole in the side of the handle right below the hilt. I could then take this leather cord. I superglued one end of the cord in, pushing it in with a small drill bit. Once that was secure, I could then twist and wrap this cord all the way around the handle, trying to keep it tight. Every once in a while I'd stop and add a little bit of super glue just to make sure that it wouldn't slide around. Once I got to the bottom, I put the screw into my pommel and I screwed it onto the bottom of my tang. At this point I made sure that I pinched the end of the leather underneath the pommel and I screwed it on tight. And that pretty much completes the finished sword. So I hope you like it. This was kind of a fun project. You can make the same thing using different materials. You can make it out of all pine and paint it, or you can use the different contrasting woods like I did. The oak blade, the walnut hilt, and the pine pommel with the leather wrap. I made my son a sword and he wanted me to make one for myself so that we could fight. So this is what I came up with. I hope you guys like it. It's a really fun project and it kind of opens up this vast category of wooden weapons that I have a feeling will be coming down the pipeline in the future. So I hope you liked it. If you did, feel free to give it a thumbs up, share it with your friends. If you have any questions, feel free to leave it down in the comments. If you want to see more videos like this, feel free to subscribe to the channel, UNI DIY. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys on the next project.